and welcome to Microsoft Build. My name is Ken Aguilar, Principal Program Manager in the Microsoft Power Platform Product Group. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Kristen Neese and Brendan Hancock, with whom we will be discussing the topic of implementing Power Platform landing zones and enterprise fusion deployment patterns. Our agenda consists of two parts. First, we will discuss key challenges and an overview of landing zones, along with their design principles, design areas, with a quick demo of our landing zone reference architecture. Lastly, we will cover enterprise deployment practices, where we will expand on the Center of Excellence, or COE, citizen developers, fusion development, and skills and culture. In today's world of digital transformation and innovation, ease of use, along with rapid time to market, is an essential part of doing business. The Microsoft Power Platform is a rocket ship that can accelerate digital transformation in organizations across the globe through the use of low-code, no-code deployments. Part of the challenge today is that many organizations, while moving to the cloud, are often replicating on-premise concepts, which may include centralized IT processes designed on cloud adoption with an afterthought of injecting and providing agile innovation into the business. These mindsets and adoption principles can be the result of architectural complexities or simply struggling to translate the business requirements into Microsoft Power Platform concepts. Lastly, once we have passed the initial challenges, security, governance, and compliance often become an afterthought and often end up being blockers. To quote one of our customers, "Hey, Microsoft, just tell us what good looks like." Now we move over to Christian, who will provide an overview of landing zones. Over to you, Christian.
Thank you so much, Ken. My name is Christian Neese. I work as a principal architect in the customer architecture team at Microsoft, and specifically working and looking after the cloud foundation and the landing zones for our various Microsoft clouds. And I'm very excited to be here to talk about Power Platform landing zones. So let's dig into it and get a common understanding what this exactly is. First and foremost, Power Platform landing zones is an architecture and design methodology that consists of design principles and design recommendations across critical technical domains for the Power Platform. The recommendations are proven, prescriptive, and based on Microsoft best practices for Power Platform as a whole. Secondly, we also provide a reference implementation that organizations can use to accelerate their journey and implement the best practices into their own tenant, using a curated deployment experience that spans both Azure and Power Platform. So before we dive into both the architecture methodology and the reference implementation, let's zoom out a bit and look at the overall architecture composition. So this high-level diagram depicts the overall composition of the landing zones in the Power Platform context, where the landing zones are, as you see when looking closer, they're actually environments. However, these environments are fully governed, they are secure, and they are compliant by default per the organization's requirements, and then democratized to the makers, whether they are citizen developers or professional developers, so they have full autonomy to innovate and create business applications. We can zoom out even further and see how Power Platform landing zones will intersect within the broader context of the Microsoft clouds. So based on some of the work we have done for the last couple of years, specifically on the Azure side, where we created and developed the enterprise scale landing zone, this basically represents the Azure part of that. Now, since we also have Power Platform landing zones, we have an ability to integrate seamlessly for organizations that can now use the landing zones in both Azure and unlock and realize the full value of the Microsoft Cloud and enable a secure, unhindered path towards digital transformation at scale for the organizations for Azure and Power Platform. Now, Ken, can you please share where we are on this journey and the next steps we are very excited about?
Thank you, Kristen. In early conversations with our customers, Microsoft field engineers, Microsoft MVPs, and other individuals within the community, we discovered common themes which influenced our architecture and design methodology. Our customers simply wanted a turnkey solution with documentation, sample architecture that could be deployed, to test our production environments in a repeatable process that would allow them to implement at scale, which is where we are today. Kristen, would you mind going in and now expanding on the architecture and design methodology?
Absolutely. Thank you, Ken. So as we looked at one of the previous slides, we have the architecture and design methodology and the reference implementation. Now I want to talk a bit about the architecture and design methodology, which is based on many large-scale customers and partner engagements over many years that we have developed and validated the key design principles that we're going to talk about, as well as the critical technical design areas as the overall architecture and design methodology. Let's start by looking closer at the design principles for Power Platform landing zones. These design principles serve as a compass for subsequent design decision across the critical technical domains. We strongly encourage you to familiarize yourself with these principles to better understand their impact and the trade-offs associated with non-adherence. So let's first talk about the environment democratization. Environments are used as a unit of management, scale, security, and policy boundary, aligned with the business needs and priorities to support the business and developers to accelerate their digital transformation. Next one is policy-driven governance. Data loss prevention policies, also known as DLPs, are used to provide the guardrails and ensure the continued compliance of the customer platform and applications created onto it, whilst also providing developers sufficient freedom and a secure, unhindered path to the cloud. The single control and management plane is where the Power Platform landing zone architecture do not use any abstraction layers, such as custom portals or tooling, but rather ensure a consistent experience regardless of persona, whether this is platform admin or developers, subject to the native built-in role-based access controls, as well as the policy-driven controls by DLP. Then we have persona agnostic. The Power Platform landing zone architecture is persona agnostic and does not treat anyone differently from an architecture and capability perspective, and provides a safe and secure foundation for all developer persona an organization may have. And finally, the Power Platform landing zone approach advocates using Power Platform native services and capabilities whenever possible. This approach aligns with the product roadmap to ensure that new capabilities are available within your environment and can be adopted in a predictable fashion. The Power Platform roadmap helps to inform the adoption strategy and landing zone trajectory. Now, together with these design principles, the core of the Power Platform landing zone architecture also contains a critical design path comprised of fundamental design areas with heavily interrelated and dependent design decisions. The architecture methodology provided design guidance across these design areas that has significant technical domains to support the critical design decisions that must occur to define the Power Platform landing zone's architecture. For each of the key design areas listed, review the consideration and recommendation provided and use them to structure and drive design decisions within each area. Now we have looked at the architecture and design methodology, and it's time for us to explore the Power Platform landing zone reference implementation next by demonstrating it from left to right. The Power Platform landing zone reference implementation provides prescriptive guidance coupled with Power Platform best practices for organizations, regardless of their industry and business application scenarios. In order to deploy the reference implementation, you navigate to the following repository, and we have a deployment button that will then launch the deployment into the Azure portal. We have already done this, so let's look at the experience and the various options we provide. In order to deploy, you need to first provide a user-assigned identity. This is then used to authorize the API interaction we make on the Power Platform side to essentially be able to bootstrap your Power Platform tenant. This also requires an Azure subscription where we can put the actual deployment resource into. Once you have provided the fundamentals, we allow you to configure the all-up tenant level security. Specifically, the data loss prevention policy is for the tenant itself. And as a starting point, you can select by picking a policy that is either highly restrictive, medium restrictive, low restrictive, or if you don't want to have a tenant level policy, although we recommend you to start with one, you can select none. The other option we provide is the tenant isolation. Note that this is still in preview, but we allow you to configure whether you want to block inbound, outbound, or both, as well as not enabling at all. The last part is the tenant guest user and sharing setting. And here you can see we are leading with the recommendation enable to yes. The next tab allows you to create the dedicated environments for the admin purposes themselves, such as using Center of Excellence Starter Kit. This together with specific tenant environment settings. So we do recommend you to restrict who can go and create environments and allocate capacity and so on and so forth, which is why we are calling that out as a recommendation. We then create the dedicated environments for the admin purposes so that you can then load Center of Excellence or any equivalent of that in order to provide certain capabilities in your organization. On the management and monitoring tab, this is where we essentially do a lot on the Azure side. So we can enable log analytics workspace. So you have observability in terms of activities happening in your tenant across a wide spectrum of other services in Azure, such as Sentinel and diagnostic settings. And at the very end, once you have configured the left-hand side, we are at the landing zone. So this is where you will provide input to how the various environments should be shaped. So for the default environment, we do recommend to rename that so the intent of that is clear for all the users who have a license. We also recommend to assign policies to further restrict what are the specific connectors available for essentially everyone who have access to that. What we do next is to allow you to create landing zones for the citizen developers. We provide a set of options in terms of whether you want to create them with Dataverse, without Dataverse, but also allow you to be more granular in terms of what you want to do on each of the environments. So in our case, we have provided a prefix and we are creating in our for this demo 8 environments. And you can also note the other settings that we have here, such as catering for ALM. So we have a dedicated environment for each, for dev, for test, and production. And also we can use a billing policy and associate that with the Azure subscriptions that we are using. We follow the same pattern for the landing zones for the professional developers as well. So here you can create the environments that are needed initially. And the key difference here compared to the citizen dev is essentially the data loss prevention policies as a starting point in terms of what are the requirements for the professional developer in that case. The final part we do is to also allow you to cater for the various Microsoft clouds for industry. So whether you're healthcare, financial services, or retail, we can also pre-create those environments and load them with the necessary D365 templates, so they are ready to go. Now, we have already deployed, so let's have a quick look at the output of the deployment. The first thing you can see here is that we have created a lot of environments based on the input that we had. The other thing I want to call out is also the tenant settings that we specified in the experience. So I have restricted who can create environments, as well as enabling the tenant level analytics. The final part I want to show is the data policies. So we started by creating a tenant level policy. We had specific DLP for the default environments, the admin environments, the citizen, and the pro dev. And as you can see, they're all here as a starting point for you to evolve as you create more landing zones for your organization. So that concludes this demo of the Power Platform landing zone reference implementation. Governance is a critical part of successful deployment and development patterns and practices. Landing zones enable your organization to deploy Power Platform using known patterns and practices used by Microsoft and our customers. Now I want to hand it over to my distinguished colleague, Brendan, who will talk about Enterprise Fusion development pattern.
Thank you, Christian, and greetings to everyone at Build. My name is Brendan Hancock, and I'm a technical architect with the Microsoft Technology Center. In my role, I work with hundreds of organizations and thousands of customers to solution Power Platform services. Over the years, I've found that most organizations first encountering Power Platform tend to have a singular perception about what the Power Platform is capable of doing, because they've only been exposed to the capabilities of one or two of the services, such as Power BI or Canvas Power Apps. Beyond the challenge of articulating what all of the Power Platform services are, organizations are increasingly seeking guidance from Microsoft on how best to think about deploying Power Platform at an enterprise scale. Enterprise organizations encountering Power Platform don't usually have a comprehensive understanding that Power Platform is a branding topology. Under the brand, there's an entire suite of Power Platform services designed for rapid application development. Some of these services, such as Dataverse, have historically been in development for over 20 years, whereas other services, such as virtual agents, are extremely new. And the newer SaaS applications are often built on Azure services, such as the Bot Framework or Logic Apps. Before an organization can develop any deployment approach, it's helpful to understand how all of the services are interacting with data. Data complexity ultimately tends to drive how Power Platform will be aligned to combined teams of citizen developers supported by IT staffed projects, which often includes professional developers. At a high level, Power Platform services enable organizations to build dashboards and analytics, mobile UX forms, employee-facing business applications, customer-facing external portals, workflow and automation, interactive chatbots, and to infuse these capabilities with artificial intelligence. At a granular level, Power Platform has the ability to connect to data within Microsoft's platform, but also to extend to connect to data in on-premises sources as well as third-party SaaS sources. Depending on the complexity of the data, the API being connected to, and how organizations are building security around that data, Power Platform will often lend itself to IT-staffed Power Platform program initiatives. There isn't a single pattern or deployment approach for enterprise organizations, as business outcomes tend to be unique for each organization. However, over the past few years, the two most popular enterprise deployment patterns have consisted of deploying Power Platform to citizen developers and deploying Power Platform with a center of excellence model. Organizations with deep technical benches or full stack development teams are often trying to pick up Power Platform to enable rapid application development, whereas organizations without any central IT department are often trying to enable citizen development. It is becoming increasingly desirable to be able to foster both of these types of adoption and deployment in an organization, combining citizen development and professional development into collaborative fusion development teams that enables the benefits of both approaches. While there are benefits and challenges to each approach, often the greatest challenge is culture. Microsoft is largely an engineering organization, so we at Microsoft often put out marketing material which includes diagrams like the one above, which calls out multiple tools. With my experience in the Microsoft Technology Center, what I found is that what customers need is more direct guidance on how to use the tools and what sort of skills and talents they would need to ramp up their employees to use Power Platform services. So I set out to write a white paper which conceptually addressed how organizations are thinking about deployment patterns and scaling up on Power Platform at enterprise scale, both technically, but also culturally. Citizen development deployment methodology involves establishing governance around the default environment and enabling citizen developers to build productive applications with as little IT involvement and ownership as possible. Existing Office 365 services are enabled, and users within the Office 365 tenant are given the ability to automate the tasks they would normally be doing across Outlook and Teams, SharePoint and OneDrive, as well as any other connectors that the Power Platform administrators determine are valuable to the business. Aside from baseline IT governance of users and connectors, deeper administration of a multi-environment scale is not required unless migrating to another deployment model. In this approach, users are encouraged to talk to one another, build a process to share information across business groups. Note that Power Platform in this approach is connected to Office 365 services. Center of Excellence, or professional development deployment models, is the most restrictive model that affords the most control. Essentially, nothing is enabled in the default environment unless approved by an IT-staffed Center of Excellence team or explicitly enabled by Microsoft. More complex projects that are identified are mapped to a dev, test, production environment topology, which is created for one or more business units. This model is staffed by professional, full-time resources that specialize in Power Platform services, and usually staffed by an IT department. Take note that in this approach, data is being connected to outside of Office 365 and into Azure services, third-party services, and on-premises services. Fusion development embraces the concepts of citizen development and professional development in a process paradigm where citizen development is allowed to thrive. There is also a monitoring process paradigm where critical line of business applications are identified by the COE and they are migrated into professional development solutions and environments. Fusion development requires a Center of Excellence staff team to consistently collaborate and monitor citizen development solutions to identify high-value tools for enterprise deployment. Consider this methodology one that combines the benefits of both models, but also the combined investment and often a change in operating models. In this model, all users are enabled to solve problems with proper governance in place for data when it can reside anywhere. With the Fusion development model, skills are required to navigate API data, infrastructure, and security in third-party connectors. Azure, on-premises, as well as Office 365 inclusive. Take note that in a Fusion development model, personas include developers and administrators collaborating across all of these services. Developing enterprise-grade Power Platform services can often become a full-time discipline at scale. This diagram illustrates how with just the Power BI service alone, organizations can have gateway administrators managing on-premise virtual machines. Data modelers and report designers are collaborating on ETL. Workspace administrators are building out security to enable citizen developers to securely report and aggregate data. Capacity administrators are in place to manage premium capacity infrastructure. And finally, Power BI end consumers. This could be even further augmented by data scientists extending Power BI with DAX, M, Python, or R development languages. The scale of complexity and resources required to deploy an enterprise model such as this requires developer and IT to work in close orchestration with the business and citizen developer resources. At scale, Fusion development is a cross-organizational team sport. Throughout the course of my white paper, debuting on May 27th here at Build, I talked through the narrative of complexity that each Power Platform service can encounter when certain technical requirements are introduced into implementation. Outlined here are the typical technical requirements and skills which trigger the need to staff IT Power Platform projects in either a Center of Excellence or a Fusion development team. Here, you can look up more information about Power Platform landing zones at aka.ms/pp landing zones. And here, you can download the white paper debuting on May 27th at aka.ms/power deployment patterns. If you're looking to learn more about business applications, Power Platform, and Dynamics 365, we've provided you these resources so that you can go check out what else is available out on our marketplace. We appreciate everyone taking the time to join our session, and we hope that you've enjoyed me and my co-presenters, Ken and Christian. Enjoy the rest of Build.
Remember, governance is key and an essential part of any successful practice. Enjoy your build. Thank you for listening.
Enjoy your build, folks. Thank you so much.